The Clock That Counts Down, Part 1. Emily had always been drawn to oddities, the kind of things others overlooked at flea markets. So when she spotted the antique clock, dark wood, Roman numerals etched into its face, arrows frozen at an odd angle, she couldn't resist. The vendor, an old man with sunken eyes, muttered something about it counting time differently before handing it over for a price too low to question. She took it home, its weight heavier than it should have been, and hung it on her living room wall. That night, as she settled into her quiet apartment, a soft ticking broke the silence. She frowned. The clock had no visible mechanism, no battery slot, no winding key. Yet there it was, ticking steadily, its sound echoing through the room like a heartbeat. She approached it, peering at the face, and noticed the hands weren't stuck. They were moving, but backwards, inching toward midnight. A T first. She found it charming, a quirky mystery to unravel. But as the hours passed, the ticking grew louder, insistent, cutting through the hum of her daily life. She tried to ignore it, focusing on her work, but her eyes kept drifting to the clock. By evening, the room felt colder, the shadows longer, stretching across the floor in ways that defied the light from her lamp. Sleep brought no relief. She dreamed of a man, an old clockmaker, his hands trembling as he adjusted the same clock, his voice a hoarse whisper, "Not yet, not yet." She woke to the ticking, louder now, reverberating in her skull. The clock's hands had moved closer to midnight, and the air in her apartment carried a faint, musty scent, like old paper or forgotten attics. The next day, she noticed something else, shadows that didn't belong. A flicker in the corner of her eye, a silhouette by the window that vanished when she turned. The ticking seemed to follow her, not just from the clock but from the walls, the floor, as if the apartment itself was keeping time. She checked the clock again. The hands were at 11:45, and a chill ran down her spine, unexplainable but undeniable. Emily decided to dig into its origins. At the local library, she found a record of a clockmaker named Elias Wren, who'd lived in her town a century ago. He'd vanished one night, leaving behind only his shop and whispers of a strange obsession with time. An article mentioned a clock he'd crafted, one that counted down to something no one could escape. The description matched hers perfectly. Back home, the ticking was deafening, a rhythm that pulls through her bones. She stood before the clock, watching the hands creep to 11:40, and felt a presence, not a person, but a weight, an awareness pressing against her. The shadows grew bolder, pooling in corners, their edges shifting like smoke. She reached to stop the hands, but they wouldn't budge. Instead, the ticking quickened, a frantic beat that matched her racing heart. That night, sleep eluded her. Again, the dreams returned, sharper. Elias, his eyes wild, muttering, it's coming," as shadows loomed behind him. She jolted awake, the clock at 11:30, and heard footsteps, not hers, not from outside, but from within the walls. Slow, deliberate, circling her room. She grabbed a flashlight, scanning the darkness, but found nothing. Yet the steps continued. A steady echo to the clock's relentless countdown. Panic set in, but so did curiosity. She opened a drawer, pulling out Elias's name scribbled from her research, and whispered it aloud, testing the air. The ticking paused, just for a breath, then resumed, louder, angrier. The shadows thickened, forming vague shapes, arms, heads, torsos dissolving when she looked directly at them. A voice, faint but clear, whispered from nowhere, "You've started it now." The clock hit 11:25, and the room darkened, not from a lack of light but from something swallowing it. Emily felt eyes on her, unseen but piercing, and the footsteps grew closer, now just behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty except for the clock, its hands glowing faintly, counting down to a midnight she wasn't sure she'd survive. The apartment wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to the clock, to whatever it was summoning, and Emily was caught in its unrelenting grip. Part 2. Emily's apartment had become a prison of ticking dread. The clock's relentless countdown dominated her every moment, its sound no longer just noise but a force, vibrating through the walls, the floor, her very bones. The hands crept past 11:20, each tick a hammer strike against her sanity, and the shadows weren't just fleeting now, they lingered, their forms more defined, hovering at the edges of her vision like silent sentinels. She'd tried everything to stop it. Unplugging the clock did nothing, as it had no power source. Smashing it crossed her mind, but an instinct warned her against it, a whisper in her gut that breaking it might unleash something worse. The footsteps echoed louder, no longer confined to the walls, but but pacing around her, a rhythm that synced with the clock's ticking, as if something was measuring her time alongside it. Sleep was a battlefield. The dreams of Elias grew vivid, his face etched with terror as he worked on the clock, his voice a desperate plea. I didn't mean to, I didn't know. Shadows loomed over him, their shapes twisting into impossible forms, long limbs, hollow eyes, mouths that opened but made no sound. She woke gasping, the clock at 11:15, and found the room colder, the air thick with that musty scent, now laced with something metallic, like rust or old blood. The shadows were bolder, no longer hiding. They stood in doorways, leaned against walls, their outlines flickering like candlelight in a draft. Emily's flashlight revealed nothing solid, but the beam trembled in her hand as she caught glimpses, fingers reaching, heads turning, gone. The moment she focused, the ticking quickened, a frantic pulse, and a whisper cut through. You're running out. She returned to the library, digging deeper into Elias Wren's story. A faded diary entry, tucked in an archive box, spoke of his final days. The clock counts what's left, not what's ahead. I made a deal to stop it, but it took more than I gave. The last line was scrawled in panic. It's here. It's always been here. Emily's breath hitched. The clock wasn't just a relic, it was a pact. A countdown to something she couldn't yet name. Back home, the clock hit 11:10, and the apartment shifted. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with the ticking, and the shadows grew taller, their forms stretching to the ceiling. Footsteps circled tighter, now inches from her, and a low hum joined the ticks, a sound like distant machinery or a heartbeat from another world. She felt watched, not just by the shadows, but by the clock itself, its face glowing faintly, its hands a cruel promise. That night, the dreams escalated. Elias stood before her, his hands bloody, the clock behind him ticking wildly. You can't stop it, he rasped, but you can join it. Shadows engulfed him, their whispers merging with his voice. Midnight is the end. She woke to a scream, her own, the clock at 11:05, and something new, a shadow in her mirror. Not hers, not Elias's, but a figure with no face, its presence a void that swallowed light. The ticking was unbearable, a drumbeat of doom, and the footsteps stopped circling. They stood still, just behind her. She didn't turn, she couldn't. The hum grew, vibrating through her chest, and the whisper returned, closer, you're almost ours. The shadows pressed in, their cold brushing her skin, a sensation like ice and static combined, pulling at her thoughts, her will. Emily grabbed Elias's name again, shouting it into the darkness. What do you want? The ticking paused, the hum faltered, and the shadows froze. A voice answered, not from the room, but from within her. Time. The clock resumed, 11 o'clock now, and the room darkened further, the light from her lamp dimming as if sucked away. The shadows loomed, their forms merging into one, a shapeless mass that pulsed with the ticking, watching, waiting. She knew midnight was coming, and with it, whatever the clock had been counting down to. The apartment wasn't just haunted, it was alive. The clock its heart, and Emily its prisoner, caught in a countdown. She couldn't escape, a silent pact ticking closer to its terrifying end. Part 3. The clock's ticking had become Emily's world, a relentless metronome of dread that drowned out everything else. The hands crept past 10:55, each tick a stab at her fraying nerves, and the apartment was no longer her home. It was a stage for something ancient, something inevitable. The shadows weren't just watching now, they were closing in, their presence a cold, tangible weight that pressed against her every move. She'd stopped sleeping. The dreams were too real, too invasive. Elias appeared each time, his face gaunt, his hands clutching the clock as shadows tore at him, their whispers a chorus of despair. You can't undo it. She'd wake to the ticking, louder, sharper, and find the clock at 10:50, the room darker, the air heavier, as if the countdown was draining the life from her space. The shadows had names now, or so it seemed. She'd hear them in the whispers: Elias, Margaret, Samuel, each one a fragment of a life tied to the clock. They stood closer, their forms flickering in the corners, their heads tilted as if listening to her every breath. The footsteps were constant, a slow, deliberate tread that followed her from room to room, stopping only when she stood still, as if waiting for her to make a move. Emily tried to research more, scouring online forums for anything about cursed clocks, but her laptop flickered, the screen glitching with static, showing glimpses of the clock's face: 10:45 now before shutting off. The hum was louder, a low drone that vibrated through the floor, and the shadows grew bolder, brushing against her, their touch a jolt of cold that left her skin tingling with an electric chill. She found a letter in her mailbox, slipped in without, a postmark, written in shaky handwriting. The clock chooses its keeper. You can't stop the count, only pass it on. It was unsigned, but the musty scent matched the air around the clock. Panic gripped her. Pass it on? To whom? The idea of dooming someone else twisted her stomach, but the ticking urged her forward. 10:40 now, the shadows thickening into a haze that dimmed her lights. The dreams intensified that night. Elias stood in a void, the clock glowing behind him, its hands at 10:35. I tried to cheat time, he whispered, but it cheated me. Shadows engulfed him, their voices merging with his. You're next. She woke to the real clock matching the dream, and something new, a shadow in her doorway. Taller, darker, its outline pulsing with the ticking, watching her with an eyeless gaze. The apartment warped around her. The walls seemed to bend inward, the ceiling lower, as if the space was shrinking with the countdown. The hum turned into a growl, and the footsteps stopped, replaced by a presence, a shadow that didn't move but stood, inescapable, just beyond her reach. The whisper came again, closer. Give it away, or give yourself. Emily's resolve cracked. She grabbed the clock, intending to throw it out, but it wouldn't lift. Its weight anchored it to the wall, defying her strength. The hands hit 10:30, and the room plunged into near darkness, the shadows merging into a single mass, a void that pulsed with the ticking, its edges reaching for her. She felt their cold, a sensation like drowning in static, pulling at her thoughts, her memories dotting. A last act of defiance, she shouted, Elias, stop this. The ticking faltered, the shadows froze, and a voice answered, not from the clock but from the air itself. I can't. The clock resumed, 10:25, and the shadows surged, their whispers a scream. Time is ours. The room trembled, objects rattling. And Emily felt a pull, not physical but deeper, as if her very essence was being drawn into the clock's countdown. She was trapped, a prisoner to the clock's relentless march, each tick a step closer to midnight, to whatever awaited her. Part 4. Emily's existence had shrunk to the relentless ticking of the clock, a sound that burrowed into her mind, her bones, her soul. The hands crept past 10:20, each tick a claw scraping at her sanity, and the apartment was no longer a home, but a shrinking cage, its walls pulsing with the rhythm of the countdown. The shadows weren't just visitors now, they were residents, their presence a constant, suffocating weight that pressed against her every breath. She'd given up on sleep entirely. Closing her eyes only amplified the dreams. Elias's face haunted her, his eyes hollow, his voice a broken whisper. I thought I could stop it. Shadows swirled around him, their forms stretching into grotesque shapes, limbs too long, faces without features, mouths gaping in silent screams. She'd wake to the clock at 10:15, the room colder, the air thick with a metallic tang that clung to her throat, and the ticking louder, a drumbeat of impending doom. The shadows had grown brazen, no longer content to flicker at the edges. They stood in plain sight by the couch, in the hallway, at the foot of her bed, their outlines sharp, their movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring her fear. She'd hear their names in the whispers: Elias, Margaret, Samuel, others. She couldn't place each one, a thread in a tapestry of despair, their voices weaving into the ticking. You're running out of time. Emily tried to fight back, researching frantically on her phone, but the screen glitched, showing static and glimpses of the clock's face. 10 now, before dying completely. The hum had evolved into a low growl, vibrating through the walls, and the footsteps were omnipresent, a slow, heavy tread that circled her, closing in with every passing minute. She felt their eyes, unseen but piercing, watching from the shadows, waiting for the inevitable. The letter's words echoed in her mind. Pass it on. She'd considered it, leaving the clock somewhere, giving it to a stranger, but the thought twisted her insides. Could she live with that guilt? The clock hit 10:05, and the room darkened further, the shadows merging into a mass that pulsed with the ticking, their edges brushing against her, cold and electric, like static made tangible. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a presence, an oppressive stillness just behind her. Breathing without sound, she grabbed a flashlight, its beam weak against the darkness, and scanned the room. The shadows didn't retreat. They absorbed the light, their forms growing taller, their whispers turning into a chant. Midnight, midnight, midnight. The clock's face glowed, its hands at 10 o'clock, and the apartment warped, walls bending inward, the ceiling sagging, as if the countdown was collapsing the space around her. In a moment of desperation, she tore at the clock, clawing at its frame. But it wouldn't budge, rooted to the wall like a living thing. The ticking quickened, a frantic pulse, and a voice not Elias's but deeper, older whispered from within, "You can't stop what's already begun." The shadows surged, their cold wrapping around her, pulling at her thoughts, her memories, her very essence. The dreams bled into reality. She saw Elias standing before her, not in sleep, but in the room, his form flickering like a dying flame, his voice a plea. "I gave it my time, now it wants yours." Shadows engulfed him, their whispers merging with his. "Join us." The clock hit 9:55, and the room plunged into near darkness, the shadows forming a circle around her, their presence a void that swallowed sound, light, hope, Emily's reflection. In a cracked mirror shard wasn't hers, her eyes were gone, replaced by hollow sockets, her face pale, her mouth open in a silent scream. The shadows loomed closer, their touch a jolt that burned, leaving her skin tingling with static. The hum turned into a roar, and the footsteps resumed not behind her but within her, a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, as if the clock was claiming her from the inside. She shouted into the void, "Elias, what is it?" The ticking paused, the shadows froze, and a voice answered not from the clock but from the air, the walls, her own mind. The end of time. The clock resumed, 9:50. Now, and the shadows surged again, their whispers a scream, "You're ours." The room trembled, furniture rattling, and Emily felt a pull not physical but deeper, as if her soul was being drawn into the clock's relentless countdown. The apartment was alive, the clock its beating heart, and Emily its prisoner, trapped in a countdown that wasn't just hours but her very existence. The shadows pressed in, their forms now faces Elias's, others she didn't know, each one a silent plea or a warning, their presence a promise of a midnight that would erase her, leaving only the ticking echo of a time she couldn't escape. Part 5. Emily's reality had dissolved into the clock's unyielding countdown, each tick a chain tightening around her soul. The hands slid past 9:45, their relentless march a death knell echoing through her apartment, now a warped shell of its former self. The walls pulsed with the rhythm, the air thick with a metallic tang that coated her tongue, and the shadows were no longer mere presences, they were entities, their forms solidifying with every passing minute, their intent palpable. She'd abandoned hope of rest. The ticking invaded her every thought, a sound that wasn't just heard but felt, vibrating through her skull, her chest, her veins. The shadows stood closer now, their outlines etched in the dim light, tall, thin figures with heads tilted, their faces blank yet somehow watching, waiting. The footsteps were constant, a heavy tread that circled her, no longer separate, but part of the ticking, as if the clock had given them purpose. Emily's desperation drove her to the edge. She'd tried reasoning with the clock, pleading with Elias's name, but each attempt only sharpened the whispers. Now a chorus of voices, Elias, Margaret, Samuel, others lost to time, each one chanting, "You can't stop it." The clock hit 9:40, and the room darkened further, the shadows merging into a mass that pulsed with the ticking, their edges brushing against her, cold and electric, a sensation like static clawing at her skin. The apartment was alive, its walls bending inward, the ceiling sagging as if the countdown was collapsing the space into itself. The hum had grown into a growl, a low, guttural sound that shook the floor, and the shadows loomed taller, their forms stretching to impossible heights, their whispers turning into a scream. Midnight is near. Emily felt their presence like a weight pressing her down, pulling at her mind, her memories fading into their endless refrain. She stumbled to the clock, clawing at its frame, but it was immovable, fused to the wall like a living thing. The hands hit 9:35, and the ticking quickened, a frantic pulse that matched her racing heart. A voice not Elias's but older, deeper whispered from within, "You're running out of time." The shadows surged, their cold wrapping around her, pulling at her thoughts, her essence, as if trying to draw her into their void. The dreams had bled into waking life. Elias appeared before her, not in sleep but in the room, his form flickering like a dying flame, his voice a broken plea. "I gave it my time, and it took me." Shadows engulfed him, their whispers merging with his. "You're next." The clock hit 9:30, and the room plunged into near darkness, the shadows forming a circle around her, their presence a void that swallowed sound, light, hope, Emily's reflection in a shard of broken glass wasn't hers. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale, her mouth open in a silent scream, mirroring the voices in her head. The shadows loomed closer, their touch a jolt that burned, leaving her skin tingling with static. The hum turned into a roar, and the footsteps stopped circling. They stood still, inches from her, their presence a cold that seeped into her bones. She shouted into the darkness, "What do you want from me?" The ticking paused, the shadows froze, and a voice answered, not from the clock but from the air, the walls, her own mind, everything. The clock resumed, 9:25 now, and the shadows surged again, their whispers a scream, "You're ours." The room trembled, furniture rattling, and Emily felt a pull, not physical but deeper, as if her soul was being drawn into the clock's relentless countdown. The apartment warped further, the walls closing in, the ceiling pressing down, as if the space itself was being consumed by the clock's power. The shadows merged into one, a towering mass of darkness that pulsed with the ticking, its edges reaching for her, its presence a void that swallowed light, sound, hope. Elias's face flickered within it, his voice a whisper, "I couldn't stop it." Before fading into the mass, Emily's mind fractured under the weight. She saw flashes, not her life but theirs, lives lost to the clock, trapped in an endless loop of counting down, each one a scream into a void that no one answered. The ticking was her heartbeat now, the hum her breath, and the shadows her shadow, inseparable from her being. In a last act of defiance, she grabbed a candle, lighting it against the darkness, its flame weak but defiant. The shadows recoiled, the ticking faltered, and the hum stuttered, but only for a moment. The clock hit 9:20, and the flame flickered out, snuffed by an unseen breath. The shadows surged back, their cold wrapping around her, pulling her into their void, their whispers a final promise. Midnight is yours. She was trapped, a prisoner to the clock's relentless march, each tick a step closer to a midnight that wasn't just time but fate, a countdown that would erase her, leaving only the ticking echo of a soul claimed by the unrelenting hands of time. Part 6. Emily's world had collapsed into the clock's merciless countdown, each tick a blade slicing through her dwindling sanity. The hands crept past 9:15, their relentless descent a death march that reverberated through her apartment, now a twisted mausoleum where light and hope were devoured. The shadows weren't just entities anymore, they were extensions of the clock, their forms weaving through the air, their presence a suffocating shroud that clung to her every move. The ticking was no longer a sound, it was a force, pulsing through her skull, her veins, her soul, a rhythm that drowned out her own thoughts. She'd stopped fighting the sleeplessness. Closing her eyes only sharpened the visions. Elias, his face a mask of anguish, his hands clawing at the clock as shadows tore him apart, their whispers a cacophony of despair. "You can't escape." She'd wake to the clock at 9:10, the room colder, the air thick with a metallic tang that stung her lungs, and the ticking louder, a heartbeat of doom that owned her. The shadows had evolved. No longer content to loom, they moved with purpose, their outlines sharp and jagged, circling her like vultures. Their names Elias, Margaret, Samuel, countless others echoed in the whispers, each one a fragment of a life bound to the clock, their voices a chorus of torment. "You're running out of time." They stood inches from her now, their forms flickering in the dim light, their eyeless gazes piercing her, waiting for her to break. Emily's attempts to stop the clock were futile. She'd clawed at it, pounded it, but it remained fused to the wall, a living thing that defied her strength. The hands hit 9:05, and the room darkened further, the shadows merging into a mass that pulsed with the ticking, their edges brushing against her, cold and electric, a sensation like static sinking into her flesh. The footsteps were omnipresent, a slow, heavy tread that matched the ticking, as if the clock had summoned them to claim her. The apartment was a living nightmare, its walls bending inward, the ceiling sagging as if the countdown was collapsing. Reality itself, the hum had turned into a growl, a low, guttural roar that shook the floor, and the shadows loomed taller, their forms stretching to the ceiling, their whispers a scream, "Midnight is yours." Emily felt their presence like a noose, tightening with every tick, pulling at her mind, her memories fading into their endless chant. She'd found a note slipped under her door, no sender, just shaky handwriting. "The clock counts what you owe. Give it back, or give yourself." Panic surged. Give it back? To whom? The clock hit 9 o'clock, and the shadows surged, their cold wrapping around her, pulling at her thoughts, her essence, as if trying to draw her into their void. The ticking quickened, a frantic pulse, and a voice not Elias's but older, deeper whispered. From within, "You're almost gone." The dreams had merged with reality. Elias stood before her, not in sleep, but in the room, his form flickering like a dying flame, his voice a broken plea. "I gave it my time, and it took me." Shadows engulfed him, their whispers merging with his. "You're next." The clock hit 8:55, and the room plunged into near darkness, the shadows forming a circle around her, their presence a void that swallowed sound, light, hope. Emily's reflection in a shard of glass wasn't hers. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale, her mouth open in a silent scream, mirroring the voices in her head. The shadows loomed closer, their touch a jolt that burned, leaving her skin tingling. With static, the hum turned into a roar, and the footsteps stopped. They stood still, inches from her, their presence a cold that seeped into her bones, her mind. She shouted into the void, "What do you want?" The ticking paused, the shadows froze, and a voice answered, not from the clock but from the air, the walls, her own mind. "Your time." The clock resumed, 8:50 now, and the shadows surged again, their whispers a scream, "Your hours." The room trembled, furniture rattling, and Emily felt a pull not physical but deeper, as if her soul was being drawn into the clock's relentless countdown. The apartment warped further, the walls closing in, the ceiling pressing down, as if the space itself was being consumed by the clock's power. The shadows merged into one, a towering mass of darkness that pulsed with the ticking, its edges reaching for her, its presence a void that swallowed light, sound, hope. Elias's face flickered within it, his voice a whisper, "I couldn't stop it." Before fading into the mass, Emily's mind fractured under the weight. She saw flashes, not her life but theirs, lives lost to the clock, trapped in an endless loop of counting down, each one a scream into a void that no one answered. The ticking was her heartbeat now, the hum her breath, and the shadows, her shadow, inseparable from her being. She was no longer Emily, she was the countdown, the clock's prisoner, its vessel, its next echo in a cycle that would never end. The clock hit 8:45, and the shadows surged, their cold wrapping around her, pulling her into their void, their whispers a final promise. "Midnight is yours." The room was a tomb, the clock its beating heart, and Emily its captive, lost to a countdown that wasn't just time but her very existence, ticking ever closer to a midnight that would claim her forever. Part 7. Emily's life had been reduced to the clock's unyielding countdown, each tick a thread unraveling her existence. The hands slid past 8:40, their relentless march a dirge that echoed through her apartment, now a warped abyss where reality bent and broke. The shadows weren't just part of the clock, they were its essence, their forms a living darkness that pulsed with every tick, their presence a suffocating shroud that consumed her every breath. The ticking was her prison, a sound that wasn't just heard but lived, vibrating through her skull, her chest, her soul a rhythm that erased her own thoughts, replacing them with its ceaseless chant. Sleep was a myth. The visions of Elias haunted her waking hours, his face a mask of torment, his voice a fractured whisper, "I gave it everything." Shadows tore at him, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes, limbs stretching, faces melting into voids until he was gone, leaving only their whispers, "You will too." The clock hit 8:35, and the apartment shuddered, the walls pulsing like a heartbeat, the air thick with a metallic tang that choked her. The shadows stood closer, their outlines sharp and jagged, circling her like a noose, tightening with every tick. Their names Elias, Margaret, Samuel, countless others rang in the whispers, each one a shard of a life bound to the clock, their voices a chorus of despair, "Your time is ours." They pressed against her, their eyeless gazes piercing, their cold a static burn that seared her skin. Emily's resistance was a memory. She'd clawed at the clock, screamed into the void, but it remained fused to the wall, a living entity that defied her will. The hands hit 8:30, and the room plunged into a darkness that wasn't absence of light but presence of something else, a void that swallowed sound, hope, existence. The shadows merged into a mass, a towering entity that pulsed with the ticking, its edges reaching for her, its presence a weight that crushed her spirit. The apartment was a nightmare incarnate, its walls bending inward, the ceiling sagging as if the countdown was collapsing the world around her. The hum had become a roar, a guttural sound that shook the floor, and the shadows loomed, their forms stretching into the ceiling, their whispers a scream, "Midnight is here." Emily felt their pull, not physical but deeper, a tug at her essence, her memories fading into their endless refrain. She saw Elias one last time, not in a dream but before her, his form flickering like a dying flame, his voice a broken plea. I gave it my time, and it took me. Shadows engulfed him, their whispers merging with his. You're next. The clock hit 8:25, and the shadows surged, their cold wrapping around her, pulling at her thoughts, her soul, as if drawing her into their abyss. The ticking quickened, a frantic pulse, and a voice not Elias's but older, deeper whispered from within, You're nothing now. Emily's reflection was gone, every shard of glass, every surface showed only static, a swirling void where her face should have been, her eyes hollow, her mouth open in a silent scream that echoed the voices in her head. The shadows loomed, their touch a jolt that burned, leaving her skin tingling with static, their presence a cold that seeped into her bones, her mind, her very being. She shouted one last time, Stop. The ticking paused, the shadows froze, and a voice answered not from the clock but from everywhere. You can't. The clock resumed, 8:20 now, and the shadows surged again, their whispers a scream, You're ours. The room trembled, furniture rattling, and Emily felt a pull not physical but absolute, as if her essence was being sucked into the clock's relentless countdown. The apartment warped into a nightmare, walls closing in, the ceiling pressing down, the space itself consumed by the clock's power. The shadows merged into one, a towering mass of darkness that pulsed with the ticking, its edges a void that swallowed light, sound, hope. Elias's face flickered within it, his voice a whisper, I couldn't stop it, before fading into the mass, leaving only the chant, midnight, midnight, midnight. Emily's mind shattered. She saw flashes, not her life but theirs, lives lost to the clock, trapped in an endless loop of counting down, each one a scream into a void that devoured them. The ticking was her heartbeat, the hum her breath, the shadows her soul, inseparable, eternal. She was no longer Emily, she was the countdown, the clock's vessel, its final note in a symphony of despair. The clock hit 8:15, and the shadows engulfed her, their cold a wave that erased her, pulling her into their void. The room fell silent, the ticking stopped, and the apartment stood still, empty, a shell where no one remained. The clock's hands rested at midnight, its face blank, its glow faded, but the air held a faint hum, a whisper of static that lingered, waiting. Days later, a neighbor peeked inside, finding nothing, no Emily, no trace, just the clock, its hands frozen, and a notebook with a single line in unfamiliar handwriting. Time is taken. The hum returned, faint but alive, a promise of the next keeper, the next soul to count down, lost forever to the clock's silent, endless hunger.